Afternoon for me. My name is Sudie Whalen, and we're going to talk about professional learning communities or faculty learning communities, depending on how you like to name it. And we're going to focus on effective communication strategies specifically within a professional learning community and how to deal with some kind of tough barriers if you run into that. I am a collaborative person. I enjoy questions, conversation, and things like that. So if you would like to join me on camera, please feel free to do so. And if you have a question at any point while I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and ask your question. I am happy to answer any questions. You do not have to wait to the Q&A period at the very end. Alrighty, so a little bit about me. My name is Sudie Whalen. I work for American Institutes for Research. I'm the Deputy Director of the California Adult Literacy Professional Development Project, or CalPro. I'm also the Literacy Information Network Communication Center, or LINCS, National PD Center Director of Online Learning. But what actually brought me to American Institutes for Research is my work with professional learning communities and collaborative team building. My areas of expertise are teacher collaboration, communities of practice, professional learning communities, those kinds of things, as well as equity in adult education, career technical education. I'm a former career technical education teacher, and integrated education and training. But my passion and the thing I really care about the most is teacher collaboration because of the impact it has on student learning outcomes. So while I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to download the slides. I'm gonna grab my sticky note so I can get that URL posted into, there it is, into the chat for you all. You can use the QR code on the screen by utilizing your phone and grabbing and scanning it really quickly, or you can click the link I just popped into the chat for you. In that folder, you'll find 5 years of SLO Symposium, professional learning community, faculty learning community content. So a lot of things I'm referencing, I'm not going to dive deeply into because we only have about an hour together. So I want to make sure we can get through our content, but there are resources for everything that I'll be talking about today within those folders. So please feel free to peruse them, grab anything you want to use, and leverage it however you would like. So you can access, again, from that link I just popped into the chat, or by scanning the QR code on the screen. And then you can access not only today's slides, but the slides for all the presentations for the past 5 years. I think there's like 8 or 9 of them. So feel free, and the handouts that go with them. So feel free to grab those whenever you like. And there we go. So our objectives of today are that I'm hoping you'll be able to identify the purpose of a learning community within your college setting, and also be able to apply effective communication in a collaborative team environment. I'm sure you all are fabulous communicators, but sometimes when you're collaborating, it can be a little hard to maintain that collaborative spirit, especially when you start running into difficult personas. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's talk first about the importance of effective collaboration. We're going to do a quick overview of learning communities, but first I have a quick question, a little engagement activity for you here. I want you to take a moment and think about a successful professional experience, collaboration experience that you have had, and then identify what were the benefits of that collaboration. So think about a positive and successful professional collaboration experience, and then share with me either in the chat or feel free to unmute, what were the benefits of the collaboration? If you'd like to unmute, please do. I love that, Melissa. We inspired each other and built on each other. Awesome. Anyone else want to share the benefits of that collaboration? I got where you're going with that, Melissa. Anyone else want to share? What were the benefits of that professional collaboration? Were you also inspired like Melissa was? Getting other ideas, Meta said, awesome. Yeah, so there's actually a lot of benefits to professional collaboration. And I'll keep monitoring the chat if you add anything in there. So some of them could be, and this comes from the book Learning by Doing, and Deborah said learning from each other. Yes, we like to collaborate, we should collaborate because, for one, collaborative teams actually increase productivity, and that's not just in education, in general. Working in teams is a norm for most learning organizations. Future leaders are expected to master teamwork, so educators like us need to lead by example. And then collaborative teams foster peer accountability. If we have shared understanding of what we're expecting to see, then we kind of tend to hold each other accountable a little bit more when those outcomes don't quite end up where we want them to be. That doesn't mean we throw each other under the bus or we're mean to each other. It means we really think about those multiplied our brain power to create disciplinary SLOs. Wonderful, love that, Nancy. But yeah, so we don't throw anybody under the bus, but we do intentionally think about how can we collectively improve and get that conversation going without being mean to one another. Remember, we always lead with kindness. So I'm going to move this captions box so it's blocking my arrows. All right, so other reasons to collaborate are that the best way to achieve a challenging goal, according to research, is through teamwork. If you have something that you're really struggling with, oftentimes bouncing ideas off of somebody else can help you problem solve and accomplish the resolution a lot quicker. Self-managed teams are more productive than any other form of organizing. A team can make better decisions and solve more complex problems than working individually by yourself. And then lastly, capacity is increased when we work together instead of in isolation. So who is actually benefits from collaboration? Well, it turns out teacher collaboration benefits a lot of people. It helps leaders, especially when you're thinking about distributive leadership and allowing teachers to lead and focus on those outcomes and things like that. Leaders don't have to put as much emphasis and focus on it. Not that they don't pay attention, they absolutely should, but you develop a trusting relationship in which you know your teams are collaborating and working together. It helps us as educators. Research tells us that collaborative teacher teams actually have a more satisfactory work life as opposed to those who work in isolation. Coordinators included in the collaboration process can also benefit from this. Collaboration benefits the organization as a whole, and research tells us that student outcomes are actually improved when teachers have shared understanding of what those outcomes are and work towards common goals together. So it benefits a lot of people. But let's dive a little bit deeper in that and talk about what that even means to be a learning community and a collaborative team, right? So when we talk about faculty learning communities, we're talking about specifically a structured learning community of faculty and staff in higher education that includes the goals of building community, engaging in scholarly practice, developing scholarship of teaching and learning. So what exactly does that even mean, right? That means that we're always inquiring and learning together to help us identify what students need to know and how to assure that they've learned it. In K-12 education, these learning communities are often called professional learning communities. In higher education, we refer to them as faculty learning communities. However, it doesn't particularly matter which nomenclature you prefer or what you're labeling your collaborative team. At the end of the day, the focus is on student learning outcomes and verification of skill attainment. Faculty learning communities and professional learning communities are pretty much the same thing, with one key significant difference if you choose to apply it, and that's the communication with parents and how you look at that kind of parent interaction data and things like that. But you can call yourself a professional learning community or a faculty learning community. Those terms are pretty much interchangeable. So when we think about professional learning communities and faculty learning communities in general, a lot of times they kind of get a bad rep because people make assumptions about what they are. What they definitely are not is a prescriptive method of teaching that removes any kind of faculty autonomy or academic freedom. We want to make sure that that's understood and that stays in place. According to a case study that was published in 2014 out of Oakland University in Michigan, by setting up clear organizational principles at the beginning of the group's inception, such as commitments to open dialogue, as well as interdisciplinary and flexible structures that embrace the heart of academic freedom, the heart of academic freedom was really accomplished. In short, as long as you and your colleagues aren't trying to control each other's thoughts, speech, and things like that, collaboration on outcomes and even assessments shouldn't lessen academic freedom. And if it does, you are most definitely doing it wrong. The goal is not for one person's view or their perspective to be the one that wins at the end of the day. In fact, it's actually the complete opposite. It's not even a majority rules democracy. It's about collaboration and engagement that leads to overall consensus and shared understanding. So continuing on, there are 4 key questions that any learning community really focuses on, and that is, what is it that we want our students to learn? How will we know when our students have learned it? How will we respond when a student has difficulty learning it? And how will we respond when a student has already learned it, right? So when we're talking about assessments, outcomes, data, we're directly talking about that first and second question. How will we know when the students have learned it, they've gotten the material, they understand it? And what exactly is it that we're asking them to learn? What are the essential skills that we want to connect them to? So when we're thinking about those outcomes, we really focus in on those 2 questions, but the 3rd and 4th question are not any less important. We also want to make sure that we're responding when a student is struggling and that we're providing interventions and things of that nature. And we also want to make sure we're not holding students back who already know content, and we're giving them opportunities to grow and continue to learn. So there's other benefits related to being in a faculty learning community specifically. One is that according to Washington State, the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. Faculty learning communities have a lot of different benefits. They're included on this list, but this is not an exhaustive list. Feel free to dive through all of the different resources I've shared in the folders because there's more to it, but I didn't want to recite an entire study to you. I will not put you through that. So faculty learning communities stimulate innovation while simultaneously creating experiential collaborative learning environments. These learning communities also provide a flexible professional development structure that supports learning around any number of topics. This could be specific to instruction and assessment, including technology integration, culturally competence, and importantly, the scholarship of teaching and learning, which is necessary to keep faculty up to date on the ever-evolving field of higher education. Faculty learning communities also increase communication and collaboration among faculty who otherwise, by the nature of their work, might be in their individual classrooms and isolated from their other colleagues. They could be feeling very siloed. My favorite thing though, and I'm going to be honest, it's probably a nerdy thing, but my favorite thing about faculty learning communities and learning communities in general is that it's a built-in data-driven continuous improvement process. And so when I'm talking about that, what I'm talking about is an ongoing cycle of inquiry. The process for improving outcomes based on data is pretty straightforward or rather circular and cyclical. I want you to just think about it briefly for a moment, but while we're talking about collaboration and things like that, I did want to make sure I'm including this in the conversation because this is the heart of what we're collaborating on. So first, we collaboratively analyze data, then we identify areas of strength and areas of future focus. What would be the gaps in learning outcomes based on what the data is telling us and what are students already doing really well. Next, we set a goal, then we participate in collective inquiry. This is where we collaborate on where changes are made in outcomes and assessments. And we're going to talk, and we're not going to get too deeply into that, but again, there's content specific to that if you want to refer back to my, I think it was 2020 session, so look in that folder. After that, after we've looked at the data, we've identified areas of growth and we've done some collaboration on outcomes and assessments, we identify the tasks, activities, responsibilities, timelines, and even resources required for us to meet whatever the goal was that we set. Next, we implement a process, carry out our pseudo action research project that we're conducting in order to formulate and monitor the adjustments that we're making. Last, we continue to monitor the results and repeat the process by identifying our next area of focus based on the data, or we go back if things did not go well and we adjust our assessment and things of that nature, and we repeat the process again. So that's kind of the whole kind of ongoing continuous improvement process of a professional learning community. Again, if you want more information about how to look at data, please dive into that 2020 and 2019 folders. There's information in there about that. So when we're thinking about communicating with our teammates, it seems pretty straightforward, right? It seems pretty easy. Most of us, well, all of us on this call most likely, have college degrees. We've taken communications courses. We are pretty solid communicators, right? But when we're talking about gaining consensus and we're talking about building collaborative teams together, we have to be really intentional because miscommunications can happen, feelings can get hurt, and then you end up running into some difficult personas, or you might yourself turn into one of the difficult personas. I'll give you an example of how I myself have not always been the best collaborator in every instance, and when we get to that section. So first, let's take a, hi Yark, thanks for joining us. So first, let's take a quick peek at what it looks like when communication goes wrong. Most of you have probably seen this clip before, but if you haven't, enjoy it. It's in the Creative Commons and it's one of my favorites.
All right, but you know, strange it may seem, they give ball players nowadays very peculiar names.
Funny names?
Nicknames, pet names.
Not as funny as my name, Sebastian Dinwiddie.
Oh, yes. On the St. Louis team, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
That's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellas on the St. Louis team.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
Do you know the fellas' names?
Yes.
Well, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, who is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
Who?
The guy on first.
Who?
The first baseman.
Who is on first?
Have you got a first baseman on first?
Certainly.
Then who's playing first?
Absolutely.
So a lot of us are familiar with that Abbott and Costello, who's on first clip from many, many, many decades ago. But it's a really, really great example of really bad communication. They did not understand each other at all, right? And he was really clearly telling you who is on first, but it kept coming out as a question, right? Now we know I'm just being silly, and that's, a really extreme example of bad communication, but communication breakdowns do happen in collaborative team building environments, right? So now what I want you to do is think about a person you really enjoyed collaborating with, like your favorite colleague to collaborate with the most in a professional capacity. What is it about their collaboration style that really stood out to you? And you can put it in the chat, or please feel free to unmute. I really like hearing people's voices. Think about someone you really enjoyed collaborating with. What is it about their collaboration style that stood out to you? I'm going to assume you're typing. Oh, somebody unmuted. Who is that?
I don't know if I have the words exactly, but I collaborated with someone who was open to listening to ideas that were different from their own. And that just made it easier for me to share ideas that were very different.
Love that. And that's actually a key point we talk about. We're going to get to in a few minutes too, about, when you're dealing with tough personas and things like that, the importance of listening and sharing and hearing and understanding and being receptive to different perspectives and ideas. Thank you so much for sharing, Deborah. In the chat, we also had listened well and had a positive approach. Wonderful. Melissa said, brought a lot to the table as far as ideas and listening to my thoughts. Wonderful. So what I'm hearing too, what I'm seeing and reading and hearing is that it was that listening piece, right? And that's a huge part of collaboration and communication, is being able to listen to others' ideas and be receptive to others' ideas, and coming to the table with ideas and suggestions, and not just concerns and issues, right? A lot of times we want to sometimes sit and complain and talk about all the things that are going wrong in the world. And let's be honest, it's in January 2022, there's a lot of things we could complain about. But when we're talking about a professional learning community, we need to come either with suggestions of how to resolve the issue that we're running into, or thinking about how can I bring this to the team and what questions can I ask my team so that we can get to a solution. Thank you for those of you who shared, I appreciate it. So let's talk about the cycle of communication, right? And this is something that most of us probably already know, but I'm going to revisit it anyway. In 1972, Michael Argyle stated that communication is like driving. It's a skill that is learned. It's not something you just have. And he explained communication in a 6-cycle process. So, there's like first step is which someone forms an idea and a thought, and then you determine how, like, it just popped into your head and you think about what that thing is, right? Then your brain codes that information in order for you to share it with someone, whether that's typing, speaking, signing, anything, and any number of different methods of communication. But your brain codes a message and then identifies the mechanism in which to deliver the message, right? The next, that message gets sent out. And at that point, the message communication cycle turns to the receiver, right? The message is received, the receiver decodes that message, and then the message is understood. But when we're talking about collaboration cycles and things like that, the message being understood in that step 6 and 4 there, the decoding of the listeners, what they've heard, what they've understood, and things of that nature, that is the point in which communication can break down. Just because you sent a message or because you said something doesn't mean that your meaning was completely understood. And that's why in collaborative conversation, it's really important to be intentional with, simple norms and things like that, like expecting or assuming positive intent. Because if someone tells you something and you kind of feel a way about it, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were intending to make you feel negatively or intending to say something negative. It could simply be a miscommunication. That's not always the case. And we'll talk about tough personas and collaborative conversations in a moment. But keep in mind that the cycle of communication is not just us having an idea, coding a message, sending a message, but it's also that message being received, decoded, and then understood in order for it to have full communication. So let's talk about effective collaboration. I don't know why my animations are so weird. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, I'm just going to load them all. So this comes from the book Learning by Doing, which is all about professional learning communities by the DeFore group over at Solution Tree. So it's important to think about a couple of communication things when we're collaborating that may not be something we commonly think about in day-to-day conversation, but it is helpful in day-to-day conversation. When we're in a group collaborative meeting, we're going to have to advocate for our ideas or the ideas and suggestions of others or for our students. We're also going to have to inquire about things, right? So when advocating, it's important to state your assumptions. I'm thinking this because why? Describing your reasoning, right? Give concrete examples of why you're feeling that way or what you saw. Reveal what your perspective is. From my perspective, this looks like our students are struggling with meeting this competency because I saw this data in the et cetera, right? Also anticipate others' perspectives. Remember earlier when we mentioned that what was really appreciated about our really positive collaboration experiences was people who were being willing to listen to other perspectives and hearing various ideas and things like that. If you're the one advocating, you have to anticipate that others will have perspectives that differ from yours and be prepared to be receptive to that. You also have to be really ready to identify areas and acknowledge areas of uncertainty. So if I'm seeing a gap in my data about my student learning outcomes, I want to be able to acknowledge to my colleagues and say, but I'm not really sure what's going wrong here, and I really appreciate your input. You also want to invite others to question your assumptions and your conclusions. That's not to say you want to, necessarily negatively challenge, but a positive challenge in questioning can often lead to ideas and suggestions and findings that you may not have otherwise gotten to if you hadn't simply asked the question. So you want to make sure, even if you're advocating for something, that you invite others to question your assumptions and conclusions. And that doesn't have to be a negative thing. That can be very positive. What data did you use to get to that conclusion? Well, let's dive a little bit deeper. Were all students present that day? How did we score? Are we using a similar rubric? How was your rubric set up? Those kinds of things. Being prepared to answer those questions and anticipate those questions. It's not a bad thing when colleagues ask each other questions for the betterment of our students. There's also going to be times when we're going to be the one on the inquiring side and not the one advocating, right? In those situations, again, you want to always lead with kindness. You want to probe underlying logic, use non-aggressive language, that simple thing that we talk about all the time, using I statements, things like that, instead of saying, you're not making any sense, I'm not understanding, those kinds of things. Draw out the thinking of others. Ask other people what they're thinking in addition to yourself. You can share your opinion and say, well, I think there could be a gap in the data and we need to look a little bit farther, but maybe I ask Susie if she has another suggestion of another, or she has other thinking, and invite her into the conversation. You might also want to check for understanding, just to make sure you're actually getting what the advocate is actually speaking about and that you understood what they were talking about. And then explain your reason for inquiring. I understand where you're coming from, but I'm a little concerned that we're not seeing the full picture. Can you share what data you were using? That kind of thing. So let's get a little bit further into this and talk about some rules for, my animations are just so off. Okay. Anyway, so sharing some rules for effective communication. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. That's a quote from Stephen R. Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Powerful Lessons in Personal Change. And I think it's really true. A lot of times, and even true of myself, I've caught myself in situations being in conversations where I'm ready to jump in and say something before they've even completely finished their thought. I don't make space and take my time to wait and see what all they have to say before thinking about formulating my questions. At least I didn't used to. This has been an active skill that I've had to practice doing so that I could become better about this. So when we think about it, it's not only important for us to hear and listen to what the other person is saying, but to also show that you're listening, right? This is where that body, not only eye contact, but your physical cues and things like that can get lost in translation sometimes. That's part of the reason why I like when people join me on camera, so I can kind of see who seems to be getting in or if anyone looks confused and those kinds of things. And when we're virtual all the time, it's really hard to lose, those little small nuances of conversation that we don't have. So, making eye contact or virtual eye contact, trying to be intentional about looking at your camera so people feel like at least you're looking at them. Although sometimes if I'm in a meeting with a lot of people, I'll say, hey, I'm looking at my bottom right screen because that's where you are. So, I'm looking at you, like that kind of thing, or I'm looking over here because you're in my upper left corner. Giving verbal cues, that the active listening skills without the sarcastic version of active listening skills. And if you have a teenager, you know what I'm talking about when they're like, okay, and they have no idea what you said. So you want to make sure that you're actually using those I see, go on, things like that, but being true about it and honest. I accidentally forgot to skipped over, avoid distractions when possible. If you're trying to have a collaborative conversation, you want to make sure everybody's fully checked into the conversation and that everybody's collaborating. So things like meeting norms are really helpful with establishing those. You want to make sure that you're giving nonverbal cues and verbal cues, right? So that I see, I got it, but then also those leaning forward body language kind of pieces when you can. It's much harder to do virtually, so I'm taking that into account. Be objective. Try to delay asking questions until you've heard everything the other person has to say. Don't be like Sudie Whalen circa like 15 years ago, who was always ready to jump into the conversation and show that I know what I was talking about when I really just need to stop and sit and listen. You don't want to dwell on 1 or 2 points at the expense of other points. It's important, and probably more important, to have accurate information than to be right necessarily. Listening to other people can prove beneficial and even teach you something. And remember, professional learning communities, faculty learning communities, even communities of practice are all about learning from each other. The speaker should also be, we should also avoid any type of stereotyping and things like that when it comes to speakers and collaborative team members and things like that. You don't want to let prejudice be associated with you, and you also don't want to let prejudice or bias impact your collaboration process. And that means that we don't want to stereotype anybody or make assumptions about anybody within our group based on their gender, ethnicity, social class, or any other type of thing that you can label someone on. When we're part of a collaborative team, we want to be equal collaborators in the conversation, and we don't want to make assumptions about anybody in our team. You want to ask questions when appropriate, but again, try not to interrupt. You never know if the person's going to answer the question while they're explaining what their messaging, right? So try not to think of your next question while the other person is giving information, because they could end up answering your question. And then lastly, summarize any key points to ensure you fully understood. So for example, if someone gave you multiple tasks, repeat the tasks back to them to ensure that you understood what they were talking about. So that's kind of not super fun, but fun-ish stuff about collaboration. So the trickier part, and this is where people get hung up quite a bit, is what do I do in my collaborative conversation if I'm paying attention to the communication cycle, I'm being very intentional with making sure my messaging is heard, I'm asking questions when I need to, but we still run into difficulties in these collaborative conversations? Well, that's because that really happens in real life, right? There are 8 tough personas when it comes to difficult conversations. And if you want access to this full article, I believe it's in my 2019 or 2018 folder when we did a lot of in-person group activities and role playing with this, but we're going to talk about it briefly now. So there's the silent participant, and I'm going to describe all of these and talk about responses to each in just a moment. The dominant participant, the scope bender, the chronic complainer, the ideologue, the naysayer, the uncommitted participant, and the insult thrower. So thinking about collaborative conversations you've had over the years of your career, have you ever run into any one of these 8 personas, or have you ever possibly been one of these 8 personas? I can tell you that I have had in the past a tendency to sometimes being a bit of an ideologue or sometimes a silent participant. And I would get in this point where I would feel like my point and my perspective was the right one. And I would just shut down if anyone wanted to disagree with me about it. And I was no longer contributing to the conversation. But that's not a good thing to do. And thankfully, I graduated college and learned more about that. But I can tell you there were probably a few people who were in group presentations with me who thought I was the worst. I was dominant and ideologue and overly silent sometimes. So have you ever interacted with any of these 8, or have you ever been one of the 8? And you can unmute or you can share in the chat if you'd like. Nancy's giving a thumbs up. So yeah, we probably all experienced this either from our own actions or from the actions of others. So let's look closer at what the characteristics of each of these 8 are and how do we deal with this. So when it comes to the silent participant, this description, the description kind of says it all, but it doesn't really give you the full scope in terms of what do you do. So silent participants tend to have more closed body language. They only speak when they're called upon. And when they're speaking, they're not really that interested. Maybe they're uncomfortable, things like that. Now, the thing about being a silent participant, about the silent participant, is there might sometimes be a reason why the person is being silent, and it might not necessarily be because they're an ideologue like I was being. So some things you can do, call on them directly, but don't embarrass them or point out their silent behavior. So in a case like that, I might, for example, call on Susie first, who's been contributing to the conversation, and then turn to Melissa and say, and I'm just picking random names, Melissa, not saying you're a silent participant, but then call on Melissa and say, I kind of agree with Susie. What do you think, Melissa? And just, solicit ideas and suggestions from them. If they give only short, shallow statements, and you could follow up with more additional questions to kind of probe more information out of them. You don't want to necessarily let them retreat back into their cocoon. And when they are talking, exude positive body language and encourage them to keep going. Now, it's important to consider that some people are simply shy and not comfortable in group conversations. So if that's the case and you know this about your colleague, you want to be careful with just calling them out and things like that and give them opportunities to share in other ways. So for example, you could send an email list out and say, here's all the different things that we came up with, and then ask each person that was part of the meeting what their thoughts were on different areas, or invite them to weigh in that way. They may be more comfortable weighing in via email or via collaborative note-taking document or something like that than they are speaking out. So, just take that into consideration. Now, next is a dominant participant. I've been this person. Don't be this person. The characteristics of the dominant participant is that they're always the first to jump in when a question is asked. They speak at length all the time, and when they run out of things to say, they'll often start repeating comments, and they'll say things, the same thing they said a moment ago in a different way, like I just did. They don't yield the floor voluntarily to other participants, and they'll continue to kind of hold the conversation hostage. So the response to the dominant participant is to acknowledge their contributions, but don't always yield to them. So if I'm the dominant participant, maybe Melissa could say, Sudi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Let's give Deborah a chance to weigh in, or something like that. She doesn't put me down. She opens the floor to somebody else to speak, but acknowledges my contribution. Encourage others to participate, perhaps by calling on them directly is another mechanism you can use to get around the dominant participant. If the dominant participant is dominant, but also negative in another way, though, you may want to deal with that separately. So let's keep going. The scope bender. We've all been in those meetings where we have a person who repeatedly pulls the direction away from the core issue, and they want to explore tangential topics that are definitely not in scope with what you're talking about. A really great way to work around this is to simply rein in attempts to stray from the topic. You can utilize a parking lot structure, whether you're online or in person, and say, that's a great idea, or that's an important topic. We should discuss that. Let's put it in the parking lot, and then we'll decide if we want to add it to the agenda for the next meeting. You want to be a vigilant gatekeeper to stay on topic. I know gatekeeping always has negative connotations, but when it comes to sticking with the agenda and maximizing your collaborative time, you want to make sure you're doing that. One of the really key roles of having in a professional learning community, in addition to having a facilitator and a note taker, is also a timekeeper. And if you rotate those roles every time, your team will get in the habit of having to stay on time and on task when it comes to your agendas. You can also deal with off-topic issues by planning to return to it later with the parking lot, like I mentioned earlier, capturing your notes or your minutes so you can be dealt with it sometime later. One really great practice that collaborative teams tend to do is the collaborative agenda. So if you have a collaborative agenda, what you can do is take anything that gets put into the parking lot, all those off-topic items, put it into the bottom of your email or your correspondence about the agenda and say, hey team, we still have these items remaining from the parking lot. Which of these items would you like to have added to the agenda? And see who advocates, and if they do advocate, to have it on the agenda. If it is advocated for, go ahead and add it to the agenda, give it a designated amount of time so that it can be discussed. One of the things that I like to do with my collaborative team meetings is if something's been on the parking lot for 3 meetings in a row, it falls off the parking lot, because if you didn't find it important enough to bring it up in the last 2 meetings and then the third comes up, then I'm going to assume we don't need to discuss this anymore. But before I dump it off the parking lot, I do include that. So I'll send the email and I'll say, hey team, here are the items that are in our parking lot. These items have been in the parking lot for the last 2 meetings, so if we don't select it this time, we need to go ahead and remove it from the parking lot, which means the team still gets one more opportunity to weigh in on speaking to that topic. So we end up managing the scope vendor issue and possibly addressing issues that they found important but just weren't on the agenda. Another one that comes up a lot is the chronic complainer. You want to avoid your meetings spiraling and digressing into becoming gripe sessions where everybody's just complaining the entire meeting and nothing gets accomplished. The chronic complainer complains about everything, claims the discussion group itself is futile. It doesn't matter what we decide here. Management's never going to let us do it. We'll never get the funds. Nothing's ever going to happen. So, those kinds of things. While sometimes the chronic complainers' concerns and their complaints are in fact valid, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to focus all of our time on doing that. So you want to be patient, refocus the discussion towards constructive ideas instead, and then reassert the mandate of the group. We've been tasked to identify solutions for consideration. Management is sponsoring this activity. We're focusing on our student learning. We agreed on these outcomes, those kinds of things. Next is my least favorite because it probably describes former Sudi the best. The ideologue is someone who refuses to accept any position other than their own. The response there will be to dig deeper, separate their position from their interest, and then find common ground between their interests and those of others. So if I was really stuck on, for example, I'm going to give a really concrete example. When we were first developing our professional learning communities, like 15 years ago, I was working with a group of CTE teachers. We're all singleton teachers teaching different things. And I was really hung up on my students are struggling with word problems in math. And some of them were really wanting to focus more on the reading and critical thinking pieces that we wanted to focus on to make that our shared collaborative thing. But I kept going back to, but my industry certification exams are showing me that my students are not passing the math components. So why should I focus on this when they're, when we need to focus on that? And then what ended up happening was one of the teachers that I work with who also used one of the same exams I did for mathematics was saying, well, maybe part of the reason they're struggling with the math is the word problem. So it is critical thinking and reading that they're having a hard time with. And then I really thought about that and I started digging deeper into my data and seeing that a lot of the problems they're missing in math were exactly that, word problems. And so by her simple comment of pointing that out helped me realize I can still focus on the math piece while focusing on the critical thinking and the reading components connected to math. And so we were able to find common ground. But it's important to be open to the ideas of others and things like that, because sometimes it's not necessarily that you won't get the thing that you're looking for, it's that there's more than one path to get there. Next is the naysayer, who is very much like the chronic complainer. They find fault with every idea, but never put one forward. They don't like anything that you want to do, but they don't have an alternate solution. Unlike the ideologue, though, they rarely put forth their own ideas of their own, and they prefer instead to attack the ideas of others. So when it comes to the naysayer, you want to reestablish ground rules or norms. If you don't already have norms like fostering equitable voice, expecting positive intent, being open to the ideas of others, remaining positive, like those kind of basic things that you all have agreed upon and that you revisit at each meeting, then you might want to consider doing that or reestablishing them if this is a problem. Gather diverse ideas without criticism. So what that means is we ask everybody to submit their idea and withhold any criticism of the idea. What that does is prevents the naysayer from having an avenue to complain or to naysay anything. And then you want to focus on selecting the best ideas together. So instead of focusing on anything negative, we say, okay, so what's the positive? So back to the deciding on what the issues we should focus on were, what we ended up doing was deciding that every person was going to put 3 topics on a sticky note and say, these are the 3 topics that I think my students struggle with the most. And we want to get more data to dive into this and see if we can teach more to these topics and get our students these skills a little bit better. Once we did that, all the sticky notes went up on the board, and then we crossed out duplicates. So we had one long list. And then instead of giving anybody an opportunity to say what they thought was dumb about any one of these suggestions, we asked for everybody to vote for their favorite ones, right? And so once we vote for our favorites, then we started narrowing it down better that way. If you're intentionally taking things through a positive lens and looking for what's the best idea, what's the best way we can do this, what's your favorite suggestion, instead of giving people an idea to rip the suggestion apart, that can alleviate the naysayer. However, It is important to think about risk and think about what could possibly go wrong once you do make a suggestion and solicit ideas. So I'm not saying you're never, ever going to ask anybody to think about what's going wrong. If you're going to do something like that, you could use a protocol like a SWOT analysis where you look for your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and you collaboratively discuss that together. You set yourself up into different groups to do these things. You could even assign your naysayer to the strengths group so they're not holding back the weaknesses group or the threats group or something like that. Another big issue in collaborative communication and collaborative team building meetings is an uncommitted participant, someone who's just not willing to be fully checked in. They might arrive late. They might return late from lunch and other breaks. They might leave unexpectedly. They might be doing other works during the meeting, during the discussion, sometimes turning into the silent participant because they're not paying attention. They might miss sessions entirely or multiple sessions in discussion groups, right? So that's definitely not okay. And the response to that is to clearly communicate the discussion objectives and how everyone stands to benefit from mutual success. Be sure to restate what everyone's active participation is needed and why that's needed in order to achieve group success. You will also take time to determine the reason for their lack of commitment. Are they bored? Are they there against their will? Are they feeling like they aren't heard? Have they felt like they were shut down previously and that's why they're not committed to participating? That sort of thing. Next is the insult thrower. The insult thrower is probably the worst in any of these groups. In its mild form, the insult thrower dismisses the opinions of others as uninformed, uneducated, naive, or just plain wrong. But in the more severe forms, the insult thrower launches verbal attacks directly at any other participant or the discussion leader. This is absolutely not okay, never okay, right? So you want to act swiftly. You don't want to allow that to happen. You want to avoid getting emotional yourself. Be stern, but a calm leader if you're the one leading this conversation and say, that's not okay. We don't talk to our colleagues this way, those kinds of things. Remind everyone that passionate participation is encouraged, but personal insults will not be tolerated. And lastly, notify administration or HR if necessary. If what they're saying is a violation of your campus policies and procedures, then you don't want to just let it go and allow the person to continue to act this way, okay? So it is important to advocate for yourself and for your team if this is something that's happening to you. I have to say, of all of the different personas, the insult thrower is the one I've seen the least, but I have run into a couple of times, and it is detrimental to a team if an insult thrower is allowed to remain on the team and continue insulting people without being addressed. So you could always hire me to come in with your professional team building and help work with you on this, but realistically speaking, it's not something an outside person should have to address. You should not let it continue and fester. And again, notify administration or HR if you need to, because it's probably a violation of policies. So how do we, as thought leaders, as people who are trying to be collaborative, lead by example, right? Don't be the silent participant. Always contribute your ideas openly. Your idea may not be the one that's selected, but it's really important that you share it. Don't be dominant. Let other people contribute. Try not to be the scope bender. Stay focused on the topic and on schedule. Don't contribute to other diversions either. So if somebody else said something and you're really interested in what they're talking about, try to avoid contributing to that diversion. Instead, say, that's really interesting and we can talk about that later, but I'm going to put it in the parking lot for now. Don't be the chronic complainer. Adopt a positive frame of mind, even in a perilous situation. Even if things are not looking the best and you're really concerned about how things are going, especially in January 2022, you have to remain positive just to get through the day lately, it seems like, right? Don't be an ideologue or a naysayer. Celebrate contributions of all kinds, even when they're different from your own. Don't be the uncommitted participant. On the contrary, you have to be the person most committed to your team's success if you're leading it. Don't be the insulting participant. Never stoop to that level. Even if someone else starts it, you will always look like the bully if you're the leader of the group. Always treat everyone in the room with respect. So that is kind of the end of my preaching at you, but now I want to give some time for questions and for you to share with any concerns that you might be having in terms of, dealing with difficult personas or moving forward as a learning community. Please feel free to unmute or share anything, ideas or suggestions you have in the chat or questions. Susie, I see you unmuted, but I can't hear you.
No, I was just going to say, I don't see any questions in the chat, just some ideas. We're a small group, so yeah, just go ahead and we're not going to stand on ceremony. Unmute yourself and speak.
Yes, please do. I like talking to people.
Hi, thank you for the information you've shared. I'm learning a lot. I'm sitting here thinking that most of the time I am actively listening, but I appear to be the silent person
Mm.
because I always assume I'm the slowest processor in the room. And so often I'm sitting there thinking and processing, and I will not ever be the first person with a great answer. So I don't know if you have any ideas for me. I'm
So you're
listening.
kind of the
Yeah.
exception that I was talking about in there, right? Like sometimes there's a reason a person is silent. There might be processing and things like that. And that's why it's important to take time for team building and getting to know your team. When we first started working as a learning community, it took us about 6 months of team building. We did all kinds of fun things. We had a beach ball exercise that had random questions on it. And there were questions about our collaboration styles and things like that. And we just tossed them, and wherever your right thumb landed, that was the question you had to answer. And so, taking time to really get to know your team and allow your team to get to know you. So they realize that you're not being a silent participant, you're simply absorbing and processing, but that you will weigh in once you have some suggestions and things that you want to contribute. And that's perfectly okay. That's a little different than being the intentionally silent participant. And then Annie, I see your question in the chat about concrete examples of how these have worked and how they have not. So if you look in that folder, I think it's in the 2021 folder, A New Way, I believe is the session it was. I included a bunch of case studies and things like that about learning communities in there. And I think I included the links and resources in there too. So you can feel free to peruse those, look through them and things like that, that tell you kind of how these things have worked and when they have not. I also included some stuff in there about, how to do this work together. So for example, if you want to do lesson charrettes as a team and start evaluating each other's work and kind of sharing what you're doing and things like that, I have examples of that in there too. So yeah, please peruse the folder and feel free to grab anything. And if you have questions about any resource or any materials in there, feel free to email me or anything like that. I'm happy to work with you all. And you can also call me. I'll put my work number in the chat if you have any questions. Good question, Annie. Other questions or thoughts? I usually kind of like small groups because we get to chat more. You're welcome, Melissa. Go ahead, Deborah.
I like the suggestion about someone on the inside talking to or addressing concerns from, I don't know if it was the naysayer or the insult. How did you refer to the insult person, the person who's insulting? It's best for someone who already has a relationship with that person. I've had to it's been rare, but I've had to address some people who were challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And it is challenging, and it's the last thing you want to do. But when you're the person with the relationship, you're the best person to do that, right?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for sharing that, Deborah. I completely agree with you. I actually had a conversation last Monday. One of the things we do at CalPro, we have a Professional Learning Communities Institute, and as part of the Institute participation, we have coaches that work with teams throughout the first 6 months of the 6 months of the Institute and for a year after to support implementation. And this is, not something we charge for, just part of the Institute. But anyway, one of the coaches reached out to me and was like, I'm having a really hard time with some of the teams that I'm coaching because one of them is the participants is just not very positive and things like that. So I met with the administrator and we talked about it, and they were aware of the issue, and what they wanted was for the coach to talk to that person. And what I said was that, we're willing to have a conversation with them, but it's not going to hold a lot of weight because they don't really know and trust us to the level that they know and trust you. And so I think it's better as an administrator for you to step in and have that conversation with them because they know you and you could actually hold them accountable. Whereas all I can do is say something, I can't hold them accountable. I was like, but we can continue to encourage and support and advise to lead with kindness and to be respectful of each other and to have respect-based norms and equity-based norms. But it really, you can't be the leader of a school and then allow people to talk to each other like this and expect an external entity to come in and take over, or even a leader of a department or even a facilitator of a team unless unless it's outside of your power structure and power dynamic. And what I mean by that is if you're facilitating the team, but you're all at the same kind of even playing field and level, you may not have the power to do anything when someone does this other than to report it, right? But if you're in a position where you can address it, then you should do that instead of expecting someone external to come fix it, because they don't have that trust built up. I'm really glad you brought that up, Deborah. That was a really good point.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions, comments, or thoughts? Well, I'm going to stay on for the remaining 11 minutes in case anybody wants to chat or has any questions. I appreciate you all staying around, hanging out, and coming to the session. Don't forget the QR code is available, and so I'm going to put the link into the chat one more time. In the event that you want to access that Google Drive folder, again, you can utilize any one of those materials. They're developed for the SLO Symposium, so please feel free to download and share however you like. Thank you all for being here.